Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the first Film Stories podcast of 2022. I'm also delighted that for the first time in the history of this podcast, I've managed to lure an Oscar-winning actor to help introduce it. Jared, over to you, quick. You can do this.
Oh, stop, you're going to make me. You're going to make me cry.
Oh, Jared, tone it down. You're going over the top.
Nobody has ever said that to me. Nobody.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
In movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome back to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, is, as the title suggests, well, I'm here to talk about the stories of film. And I talk about production stories, development stories, marketing stories, release stories, strange accent stories, all the bits and bobs, really, that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to choose for this podcast, they have more of a mainstream leaning to them than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I do try not to punch down. I do try not to do snark. I will pull the leg out of one or two things in this particular episode. But basically, this podcast is a celebration of films and the fact that they get made, how hard they are to get made, and how much I appreciate that they get made. Without further ado, I'm going to crack on with the first of the two films I'm talking about in this episode of Film Stories. I'm going back to 2001 for a big ensemble crime heist thriller, first of all. Let me play you a clip. I'll come to the story of this one, the other side of this.
It's never been done before. What's the target? When was the last time you were in Vegas? You want to knock over a casino. 3 casinos?
Vegas, huh?
Vegas.
Fantastic. The heist is impossible.
Casino security cannot be beaten. You're out of your minds.
Exactly.
You are up to something, Danny. What? You're pulling a job, aren't you? You're a thief and a liar.
I only lied about being a thief.
You're gonna need a crew as nuts as you are. Who do you got in mind?
Smash and grab job, huh? Slightly more complicated than that.
Say we get down the elevator we can't move, and past the guards with the guns, and into the vault we can't open. We're just supposed to walk out of there with $150 million in cash.
Yeah.
That then was a clip from 2001's Ocean's 11, directed by Steven Soderbergh with a screenplay by Ted Griffin, based on the 1960 film Ocean's 11, starring the Rat Pack. We'll come to that shortly. The cast for this one, let's take a deep breath. You've got George Clooney, Bernie Mac, Brad Pitt, Elliot Gould, Casey Affleck, Scott Caan, Eddie Jemison, Don Cheadle, Carl Reiner, Shabo Quinn, Matt Damon, Andy Garcia and Julia Roberts leading the ensemble of this one, with a cameo in there as well from Lennox Lewis amongst others. And the story of this one, well, it does go back to the original 1960 movie starring the Rat Pack. So Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford was in the cast, Angie Dickinson was in the cast. And this was an era where films were being built around the personalities of particularly Martin, Sammy Davis Jr. and Frank Sinatra, that people would go to the movies to watch these glamorous stars, not necessarily in the best told stories. I think it's fair to say there are few outright classic Rat Pack movies, and Ocean's 11 was a good idea, the whole idea of getting a gang together to rob Las Vegas casinos, but few people actually remembered the film fondly. But at least people remembered it. In particular, a producer by the name of Jerry Weintraub, who passed a few years ago. But he had such an incredible career. And throughout it, he'd managed the likes of Sinatra. He'd managed Elvis at one point as well. And he wrote an extensive memoir that actually ended the memoir just as he came to Ocean's 11. So that's the last thing in it he talked about. But he talked about the original film's release, that he wasn't involved in the original original film, but he was certainly very much aware of it. And he had sort of the same frustrations that everyone else seemed to have with it at that point, that there's a better film in here than we've ultimately got, that the idea is strong enough to support something better. But as we were getting towards the end of the 1990s, which is when the idea really started percolating, the idea of getting a huge cast of movie stars together was an expensive one. And so, as much as that was in his mind, he nonetheless got Ted Griffin to start putting together a screenplay for a new take on Ocean's 11. But right the way throughout, he knew that if he was going to make this film, he was going to need a really starry cast, and he was going to need the budget to pay for them. There's no way this could be an independent movie. Now, separately, Steven Soderbergh and George Clooney had worked together for the first time on the thriller Out of Sight, which hadn't done great box office business, but is rightly a hugely regarded thriller and a very, very strong one. The two had enjoyed working together so much that they'd set up a production company called Section 8, and Jerry Weintraub sent the script to them, and they had a look at it, and within 24 hours, they knew that this was a film they wanted to do. They'd been actively on the lookout for a new project to do together. They'd enjoyed working together. They were very keen to make films together, and they said yes. And in saying yes, what that also brought was some instant star wattage to the film. Because by this stage, George Clooney was a bona fide movie star. It had a bit of a false start to that with the likes of, well, Batman and Robin infamously. That was a hit, but potentially could have been a career wrecker. But as I've discussed on this podcast before, he'd hit with the likes of Three Kings. He'd hit with The Perfect Storm as well. And so he was a bankable Hollywood leading man. And as such, having him at the top of the call sheet, well, that was an appeal. So it was an appeal to others as well. I mean, that was the crucial thing. And they talk about this around the time of the film's release in a big article in Total Film magazine, that George Clooney came in and looked at it straight away and just said, look, we're going to need a lot of people to do this. I'm going to cut my fee straight away. And he was going to lead from the front on it. Now, whether Soderbergh was going to direct, well, he confessed he wasn't necessarily sure about that. He'd just come off doing Erin Brockovich. He'd done Traffic. It was the Limey was in the midst around that time as well. But as he would confess in an interview to the BBC, he says, to my mind, there is a certain technical standard involved in making a film like this. And he admitted, I was concerned that I wouldn't measure up. He nonetheless wanted their challenge and accepted the challenge. He said, I made sure I did a lot of homework. He said, I studied some filmmakers that I thought were comfortable working in this sort of arena, just in terms of technical skills, and he armed himself with the tools he needed to make this film right. So then it was a case of let's fill that ensemble up. And as Jerry Weintraub explains in his memoir, it was George Clooney at the front of it who was actively making the phone calls himself to try and persuade people to join the cast. The rules were everyone was going to have to take a pay cut to appear in the film, and they were also made aware that this was in no way going to be reverential to the earlier Ocean's 11, for which there was precious little affection for it. But by Clooney from the off being willing to scale his rate, that people entering the project knew what the rules were. They knew they were all on roughly equal footing for this one. And gradually, as the project got set up at Warner Brothers, there was a chance to make this without having to spend $100 million up front in order to fund the movie. As Soderbergh observed as he was putting all this together, the original Ocean's 11 is probably more notorious than it is good, and this was at the front of his mind when he was putting the casting together as well. He said it was the first time that the Rat Pack appeared en masse in a film. He said they were the epitome of cool, and none of us felt like we wanted to compare ourselves to them or to what they were up to. He said, you can't beat that. We took a completely different tack. And thus that's where Ted Griffin's script zeroed in far more on the plot, whilst delivering these character roles that actors were really interested in playing. So we get to the start of 2000, and Brad Pitt was a major name signed up in the January of that year. And as Variety reported, said Pitt had already met with the director, and as a result of him coming on board, the role that Brad Pitt would go and play in the film, Robert Rusty Ryan, was beefed up as a result. And at that stage in early 2000, some of the other names who were being rumoured for possible involvement in the film were Johnny Depp, Depp, Julia Roberts, Mike Myers, Luke Wilson and Owen Wilson. Again, it was known, even in the trade press at this point, you were going to have to take a pay cut to be in the movie. So a couple of those rumours would pan out. Luke and Owen Wilson actually were offered roles in the film. I think this is pretty well known. But they were committed to doing another movie with Wes Anderson, The Royal Tenenbaums. One person who turned the film down was Mark Wahlberg, who had worked with George Clooney a couple of times at this point. He turned down the role of Linus that ultimately would go to Matt Damon because Wahlberg had another film he wanted to do. He wanted to do Tim Burton's Planet of the Apes reboot, which, again, was a box office hit, but not a very well liked film. One person who was offered a role who didn't ultimately take it up was Bruce Willis. And Willis, I mean, at this point was coming off the back of things like The Sixth Sense. I mean, he was at a real career peak at this stage. But in his view, all of the really good roles that he'd wanted to play had gone by the time the script and the offer came to him. So whilst he was interested in being involved, there was nothing really there for him. Nonetheless, the door was clearly left open for him to appear in a potential sequel, which is how it panned out. And his appearance in Ocean's 12 would be, I mean, it's fair to say, quite a moment in that particular movie. Julia Roberts, meanwhile, there's a story that did the rounds heavily at the time the film was coming out, was earning $20 million a movie at this stage. And so when George Clooney approached her, he sent her a copy of the screenplay with a $20 bill attached and a note saying, I hear you get 20 a picture now. And the offer went to her that way. And again, she was keen to get involved with this one. And it was Matt Damon who really put his finger on it. He just said of all the actors who took part, they'd rather have a small part in a big movie than a big part in a hitty movie. And by everyone taking the pay cut, Damon said they'd already signalled that they weren't necessarily there for the money. They were there because they wanted to make an interesting and fun film. Now, one of the interesting things that also came through in the promotion, I remember this vividly at the time because it wasn't really the kind of thing that people talked about, was that the implication that no unpleasant people were to be part of the cast. And Soderbergh, going back to the total film piece that I was just talking about, talks in there about he'd worked with actors who just wouldn't fit something like this, that actors whose temperament and mood and the way they behaved really wasn't right for this. And in fact, I dug out the press notes that were handed out for Ocean's 11 around the time of its release, and it's in there as well. That Soderbergh said we'd have to make sure to get the right stars, the right cast, because they're supposed to have camaraderie, which is very hard to fake. And he said it had to feel like they enjoyed each other's company without having it look like they were there. They were having more fun making the movie than you are watching it. So there's a very slight undercurrent to that. But he added then to the BBC, he said, we cast it very carefully in every role, choosing people who would add to that good feeling and avoiding people who we felt wouldn't. And he said that the best testament to that is when they were shooting the film, that it's an ensemble, given it was an ensemble piece and people could drift in and out of it and head off, even when they weren't filming, lots of the actors just hung around and were having conversations. It's worth also noting that even though they were avoiding quite a lot any reference to the previous Ocean's movie, they did bring back two people who'd made appearances in it. Angie Dickinson and Henry Silva would take cameos in the new version of it. But other than that, this was pretty much their own thing. And so, production would begin on the 11th of February 2001, and this would be a very inevitably primarily a Las Vegas-centric shoot. It did shoot entirely in the US, just in a couple of different locations. And by most accounts, it was a very, very enjoyable shoot as well, although as Soderbergh would note, often more enjoyable for the cast than him, because he was the one ultimately who had to wrestle it into shape. I mean, he gave an interview as well about when asked why was he doing a remake and what was the appeal of remakes, and his argument was it's better to remake a bad movie than a good movie. And so they kind of went into it with the positivity of that, and he doubled down on the fact that they would have to break up chats between everybody so they could get on with the filming. So such was the way people were getting on with each other. There are a fair few parties going on, and just really the camaraderie they were looking to bring to the screen was happening behind the scenes as well. Now, going back to Ted Griffin, the writer of the movie, he was adamant that he didn't want to put winks into the 1960s Ocean's 11. The furthest he got in his script was he wrote in some Frank Sinatra references, but Soderbergh took those out. And there were temptations to put things in. I mean, the two of them do a commentary track on the DVD, which, well, they talk in there about, there were opportunities, for instance, there was pictures of Sinatra in the background when they were filming. They could have brought them in, and they resisted the urge to do so. They did make pretty much a clean break on this one. Griffin was on set though, and this was something that Soderbergh wanted. And over the course of these podcasts, there are a few instances, not many, of where directors like a writer on the set. I think back to the wonderful film Pride, where the director Matthew Walkers wanted the writer Stephen Beresford right by his side throughout that, so that they could effectively work together on putting the film, in making the film right. In the case of Ocean's 11, Soderbergh wanted Ted Griffin there, that he liked, because they were sort of doing little tweaks as they went along, and Soderbergh liked having the writer at hand that he could talk to him about little things he wanted to change, and he was a key component, creative part of the movie, and Soderbergh just wanted him as the movie was shot. It was the location filming brought with it some certainly logistical challenges, just in terms of things like set construction, because, I mean, going spoiler light on the film, there are massive vaults, there's a lot of interior casino work in this one, and in the end it was 20 different full sets had to be built for the movie, on top of partial sets that were also built that then could be accommodated into some of the locations in which the movie shot. They'd done an awful lot of location scouting just to find where they could shoot in the first place, but also they'd gone around pretty much every casino they could find in Las Vegas to take inspiration from that when putting their sets together. They still, though, needed a major Las Vegas hotel to be the home of a lot of the scenes in the production. And as Jerry Weintraub explains, that they selected the Bellagio in the end. He said it's the prettiest hotel in Las Vegas, and he said it's also the most luxurious and the most important hotel in town. Now, the filmmakers have been very, very open about the fact that this movie could not have been made, certainly not on the budget it was, without Jerry Weintraub and his contacts book. That he knew people. He had decades of experience in the entertainment industry. He had contacts in and around Las Vegas, and he was able to make calls. He was able to call in favors, and it was to the point where they were able to build a set within a casino that would knock out the room of 150 slot machines, and basically that the casino was sacrificing income, trading income, by having the film in there. But the flip side of that was Weintraub knew in his heart, he knew that there would be an appeal to this, that people would always, the casino would always be able to say, oh, this was the movie where George Clooney shot Ocean's 11 and things like that. And so he played on that as well. And so he explains that at the time he made the deal for the Bellagio, it was owned by a man called Steve Wynn, who he said was a dear friend of mine. He said, I'd shot movies in his Mirage Hotel before, so he had a sense of what I would be doing, and he trusted me with the reputation of his hotel, even though we were going to rob it. And he says, as it happens, before we even began to film there, he sold the hotel to Kurt Kerkorian, who also happens to be an old friend of mine, so our plans went forward, and they were able to shoot for weeks in the Bellagio in Las Vegas. Soderbergh was just saying, I mean, he noted while he was shooting, he said, this is the kind of film technically that people like Steven Spielberg and David Fincher and John McTiernan could do with both hands behind their back. But he said, not me. It was a struggle for me. He said, halfway through this film, I was wondering what I got myself into. But nonetheless, he was able to realise what he wanted to do. He talks in the DVD commentary a few times, for instance, about sequences where he didn't think he got the lighting right. However, in those moments, he also saw that the performances were strong and he didn't want to sacrifice those. So he didn't go back and reshoot those. Instead, he kept them in, but just acknowledged them as they played in front of him when he was recording the commentary, that he wasn't entirely happy with them. There was a very late bit of casting and that was the late great director Carl Reiner, that he came in to play Saul Bloom, but he came in at 5 days' notice, that he was given the scenes he was going to shoot, I think it was the end of the week before, when someone else had dropped out. They didn't name who dropped out, but Reiner was on set 5 days later and delivering his lines and knocking his performance out of the park, as they describe him. Don Cheadle's character, it should be worth noting, was originally in the screenplay. He plays Bashar. He was originally in the screenplay written as British, then not British. And then when Cheadle was cast, he decided to play him with a British accent again. It is a very infamous British accent that he did in this one. He goes full Dick Van Dyke, Mary Poppins style British accent, and it remains a standout talking point of the film. But in the context of this particular podcast, it's just in the minor leagues when it comes to over-the-top accents. I might come to that a little bit later. There was an ongoing threat of strike action in and around Hollywood filmmaking at this point as well, and so with that in mind, Soderbergh was having the film cut at the point that they were shooting it. Stephen Mirioni was editing the movie as they went along. But what this allowed Soderbergh to do was basically keep an eye on the footage that he would go in at the weekend in particular and see how much of it had been knitted together, and was able to insert shots as he needed as he went along, which minimised any requirement for reshoots. He was also the cinematographer on the movie, Soderbergh was as well, though he took an anonymous credit on that. He was credited as Peter Andrews, but it was actually him who was the DP. And the whole thing wrapped up filming on the 7th of June 2001, and on the whole, a very good time had been had by all. Now, the movie was then being lined up for a Christmas 2001 release, so they had 4 or 5 months to edit it into shape. The first preview they did of the film, it went down well, but what they took away from that was that people were more interested at that stage in the characters than the plot. And so when they were re-edited, they did some re-editing work on the film at that stage to bring more of the character material back into the cut of the movie. And as Soderbergh describes, there are barely any deleted scenes for Ocean's 11, simply because pretty much all of the whole script ended up in the film, that there was very, very little wastage. It helped that Soderbergh was going and reshooting things as they were going along as well, but it was a very efficient piece of filming, and pretty much everything he shot would make it into the final cut. There were one or two little things on the credits of this one, because one person whose name isn't in there is Don Cheadle. Now, Cheadle asked in the end that his name was not used in the promotion or on the poster for the film, and thus he does not appear there. And whilst he wouldn't go into the detail of that, he did give an interview around the time to the outlet Black Star News. He said, with Oceans, there was some stuff that happened behind the scenes that I didn't like how it went down, so I just said, take my name off it. And he's never really gone back into that. One person who was credited in a slightly different way was Julia Roberts. Now, it's worth noting that while the film was shooting, both Steven Soderbergh and Julia Roberts both won their Oscars. Roberts for Erin Brockovich, Soderbergh for Traffic, and they came back to the set the same day in Soderbergh's case, the day after in Roberts' case, to be greeted by another excuse for a huge party, really, which was duly had. But when it came to crediting the now Oscar-winning Julia Roberts, they had an idea. There had been lots of practical jokes in and around the shooting of the film anyway, but the suggestion was put, well, why don't you make Julia Roberts' credit introducing Julia Roberts, that hot credit you put in the opening crawl of a movie when you are introducing a new talent. Yet the irony, of course, was here is one of the most famous women in the world. So that went to Roberts' agent, who didn't like the idea. Roberts herself found it entirely hilarious, however, and thus it stayed in. Now, there was another slight change done in post-production as well, in that the hotel in the film where the characters of Tess and Terry, and they see it being demolished, was a fictional one called the Xanadu. However, when the scene was filmed, this is how it was described, the characters were actually meant to be witnessing the demise of the New York Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas. But 2001, of course, was the year of the terrible atrocities, terrorist attacks on the towers in New York City. And in the aftermath of that, they did some CG work to create the different name for the hotel in the movie with that sensitivity in mind. The film then was wrapped up for $85 million in the end, although it's worth noting that a lot of the cast had good back-end deals on this one. It landed it before critics who really, really loved it. as well. There was a real sense that this was a terrific caper and a hugely fun film that even those who were pushing back against it just felt it had something of classic Hollywood. It had a zip about it and an awful lot of fun. The very worst people could describe it as was an awful lot of fun. They could also describe it as a huge box office hit as well, because when it went in front of American audiences, it opened with a $38 million opening weekend in December 2001. This was a film that knocked Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone off the top of the American box office. The other films that were around that week included Behind Enemy Lines, Monsters Inc., Spy Game, Black Knight, Shallow Hal was around, Amelie was in the top 10 of the US box office, which I always brings a smile to my face. What a lovely film that is. There was no other major opening that week though, and so Ocean's 11 had a real clear path, and I suspect that no matter what was in its way, it would have steamrolled it. In fact, the week after, the Tom Cruise headlined Vanilla Sky came out, and Ocean's nearly kept that off the top of the box office as well, and it proved to be a continual hit right throughout Christmas, that when Lord of the Rings came out, the first Lord of the Rings film came out, 2 weeks later, Ocean's was still hanging in there at number 2, and it would hang in at number 2 over the Christmas period as well, even as Lord of the Rings was eating up tons and tons and tons of box office. By the time its box office run was complete, the film had made $183 million in the US, another $267 million overseas. That even at a point where this was where Hollywood was leaning more towards special effects than movie stars, there was a real sense that star wattage and star power could make a film travel right around the world. That was certainly the case here, and the $450 million in the end that was banked for the movie, well, thank you very much for that. It was thus almost an inevitability that a sequel would follow, and in fact, well, we had a few of them, that in 3 years later, everyone got back together for Ocean's 12, which was far less better reviewed, far less better, is that a phrase? I'm going with that. But nonetheless, made money, and then Ocean's 13 followed in 2007, which was an improvement on 12, I'd suggest not quite as good as 11, but that made money as well. There was then the revival that came around in 2018, which was Ocean's 8, which was significantly recast, inevitably led by a female cast this time, including Sandra Bullock, Cate Blanchett, Helena Bonham Carter, Anne Hathaway, Sarah Paulson. That was Jerry Weintraub's idea as well, with the backing of Soderbergh and Clooney, and that too was a hit, to the point where there may yet be another adventure there as well. Because it turns out that no matter, even if you put a Rat Pack in a movie about heist and bring together a load of stars into one film, no matter whether the film is good, middling, bad, it's kind of thing people like to see. And the fact that these films have such a breeze of cool about them, that they're so much fun, and it's been a lot of fun revisiting this one for this podcast. Well, I think we could all use a bit of that at the minute, couldn't we? Which brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. Thank you for bearing with me so far. I hope I've not bored you to death just yet. Just the usual parish notices I'm going to do in the middle of this podcast. So if you like this podcast and you like the work we do with Film Stories on the website as well, we do have a Patreon, patreon.com/Simon Brew. Any support you can give there is hugely appreciated. The funding that goes through the Patreon pays for research materials for this podcast, but also crucially helps me pay new and upcoming writers as well, which is where the vast majority of those funds are directed. You get podcast releases early, you get behind the scenes news and bits and bobs there as well, and hopefully some big news coming for Film Stories later this year. I tend to put it all there first, really. Even if you don't want to back us on Patreon, if you can subscribe to this podcast, that helps enormously. And if you can leave ideally a hugely positive review, that helps enormously as well. I'm an independent, I'm not a big conglomerate or a big company or anything like that, so things like that really do help a lot, and this podcast wouldn't have got this far without the backing of people doing that for me, really, and it is hugely appreciated. But without further ado, I'm going to go to the second of the two films I'm going to talk about in this episode of Film Stories. I'm moving forward 20 years now to 2021. Again, I'm going to play you a clip. I'll come to the story of this particular one the other side of this.
Paolo, why don't you have your own line?
These are just mock-ups. I can't afford to get serious.
With your gift and your talent and your vision, are you kidding? Gucci needs no blood. Goodbye 1930s. Hello 80s. Huh?
Oh, you took the words right out of my guts.
Hello Gucci is coming.
That then was a clip from 2021's House of Gucci, directed by Ridley Scott. The screenplay credited to Becky Johnson and Roberto Bentivegna. Story by Becky Johnson, based on the book The House of Gucci, a sensational story of murder, madness, glamour and greed by Sarah Gay Forden. And the cast of this one, well, Lady Gaga, Adam Driver, Jared Leto, Jeremy Irons, Salma Hayek, Al Pacino, Jack Houston in the ensemble as well. And an extensive ensemble for a long time spanning film, which had been in the offing, well, some 20 years before. Because the first idea of making a film about the Gucci family, the infamous fashion house and fashion label, and a family with, they've got far more money than me, so let me put this delicately, some problems behind the scenes, goes right the way back, in fact, this one, to 1999. So that's the year before the aforementioned book came out. So that was when Martin Scorsese was interested, and a production company called the Artist Production Group. And they first started then exploring an adaptation of a different book, a book called Gucci, A House Divided. And at that point, Kathy Silverman and Lisa Block were hired to pen a screenplay. And Scorsese wasn't just looking to produce this, he was intrigued enough to the point of indicating he might direct the film. And so this now moves forward to the summer of 2000, when Scorsese was seriously toying with that. Now, he was in preparation for another film at that point, a film called Gangs of New York that I've covered before on this podcast, and that would turn into, well, quite a resource and time hog for him. And so the trail of Scorsese's take on the Gucci story soon went quiet. But the idea of doing a film didn't, although it would take some years for it all to resurface again. It was thus in 2006 that a news story next popped up at Variety, revealing that the long-planned film based around the Gucci fashion family was finally moving forward, and there were new people involved. So Ridley Scott was involved at this point through his Scott Free production company, and he'd indicated this was a project he was really keen to make. The film had been set up at Paramount Pictures, so it already had a studio backer at this stage, and as such the resource was there to bring in a writer to work on a screenplay. Andrea Berloff was the person who got that gig. She started working on it, and even at that stage, some 16 years ago, Ridley Scott was considering directing this one. Now, it is worth noting that this was a time when Ridley Scott was considering directing a lot of things. In fact, I don't think that time has particularly gone away, that he's perennially linked with project after project after project, and this was one of the many that he was juggling. The framework, though, even in 2006, wasn't a million miles away from the film that we ultimately got, the idea that it would span various decades, various locations, various members of the Gucci family, and dig into this story. And at this point, Sarah Gay Forden's book, The House of Gucci, had come out, and that really helped contextualise it all. That gave some degree of foundation to the story that they all wanted to tell at that point. But what Scott hadn't decided is if he wanted to do it next at that point, because he had something else on his slate. That project, the one that he was just about to make, was a film called American Gangster, a terrific film called American Gangster as well, with Denzel Washington in the lead role. And in fact, once he'd shot that and released that, and that got Oscar attention, he would then shift his attention. The next film he got to a position where it was ready to go was Body of Lies, with Leonardo DiCaprio working with him for the first time. And so whilst the Gucci project was rumbling on in the background, Ridley Scott just wasn't messing around, wasn't wasting time, not making films. He was getting his cameras out, and off he was going. Time thus went on, and so we get to 2009. At that stage, Scott was still working on the film, and this was the point where casting really started to come up as well, because big names were starting to be considered for the key roles in the movie. So Angelina Jolie was said to be in talks at that stage to play Patrizia Reggiani, Maurizio Gucci's ex-wife, and Patrizia Gucci was reported as telling the Italian press at the time that she she wasn't particularly happy with the way that this was going. She said she feels bamboozled and betrayed by Giannina Faccio, Ridley Scott's wife, who was one of the film's producers as well. And it was Giannina Faccio who, in fact, really prompted Scott to pursue this project. She'd spent time with the Guccis in Florence and had assured them that tonally this was going to be right. But the Gucci family were already expressing rumblings that they weren't content with the direction of the project. And in fact, Patrizia Gucci said that, allegedly said that they would try and block the movie if they found it offensive. Now, given that the Guccis were and are not without resources, this was a legitimate problem for any film project going forward. There is a reason our television screens are full of reality TV shows that are punching down on people who are poor, who are without resource. That's generally because they can't afford to sue or even threaten to sue. If you're putting real life rich people in your film, you better have a bulletproof legal case for it, otherwise there might be trouble down the line. And so there was a concern there. Nonetheless, by November of 2009, it looked like the film was definitely going ahead. That after a decade of development, Jolie was still strongly rumoured at this point, but not confirmed to be taking the lead. And the plan this time was for Ridley Scott to slot it in after the next film he was going to make, because he decided to make a film called Robin Hood with Russell Crowe, which he did indeed go on and make. So he needed to complete that. And then the idea was, once Robin Hood was done, he would shoot what would become House of Gucci in 2010, get that released in early 2011. But he did hint at that stage in an interview published by Vogue that the script wasn't quite right yet. He was also downplaying casting rumours that Leonardo DiCaprio was going to co-star, that they got on well making Body of Lies, so it was a genuine possibility that the two would come together again. But once he was done with Robin Hood, Ridley Scott found something else to interest him instead, and off he would go to revive Alien on the big screen with 2012's Prometheus, which I talked about a few episodes back. So at this stage, with Scott's attention on Prometheus, which would eat up a lot of his time, he was dropping out of directing the Gucci film in favour of taking on a producer role on it instead. In his place, in October 2012, it was reported that the replacement director was Jordan Scott. Now, Jordan Scott had written and directed a 2009 film called Cracks, which is worth seeking out. Ridley's daughter as well. She was announced to be directing the film. Angelina Jolie at this point had moved on in the interim, in the couple of years while it had just been lingering around in development. And so now it's Penelope Cruz was going to be a high-profile piece of casting for the movie. But then the trial went cold again after that, and Jordan Scott's film of House of Gucci ultimately never happened. So when the whole thing resurfaced, there was finally another studio willing to back it, because at this point Paramount Pictures had dropped out. Paramount's big screen release strategy had been altering somewhat, and so in its place had come a company called Annapurna Pictures. Now, Annapurna is a company funded by a woman called Megan Ellison, and her company was actively spending big money on the kind of films that studios weren't backing. So there are lots of complaints about how studios avoid mid-budget things by the end of the early 2010s and later 2010s, that if you had an ambitious drama, there's no way you could get 50-60 million out of a big studio to make it. And so Annapurna saw an opportunity there, and Megan Ellison did as well. And so it started investing in the kind of films no one else would. So a case in point was Catherine Bigelow's terrific film, Detroit, was at this stage one of the projects that Annapurna was developing. And so it decided to get involved in the Gucci project, and it lured a new director into the picture. That director was Wong Kar-wai, who's directed stuff like 2046, In the Mood for Love, and The Grandmaster. And he was now going to take the film on. This was reported in November of 2016. A new screenwriter came into the picture at this point, Charles Randolph, who'd worked on The Big Short for Adam McKay. He'd taken a stab at the script, and it looked like the funding was in place. Margot Robbie was now now being mentioned as taking on one of the lead roles. But the problem here, even though it was never explicitly concerned, was Annapurna's gamble soon went sour, that it was spending big money on ambitious movies, but audiences didn't respond to those movies in the way that they'd hoped. So again, let's look at Detroit. I mean, it lost a lot of money. It's a terrific film if you get a chance to see it, but it wasn't the kind of film that was putting money in the coffers. And Annapurna, as much as it went in with ambitions to do things in a certain way, soon found itself struggling to do so. And that's likely, although I can't say definitively, one of the reasons why the Gucci project never really got much further there. And so, back in limbo again, it lost Wong Kar-wai as its director, and it would take the best part, well, pretty much the rest of the decade before it bubbled back to the top of Ridley Scott's to-do list. So he directed, in 2017, he released All the Money in the World, a film infamous by him replacing Kevin Spacey's role with that, with Christopher Plummer, within just a couple of weeks. But what we didn't know then was that would be his last cinema release for, well, 4 years. Now, by the time we get to 2019, Ridley Scott was back wanting to direct the Gucci movie, that it had gone through various incarnations, various iterations, that new writers were coming in. That's where Becky Johnson and Roberto Bentivegna were on board to do a new take on the screenplay. But if there was a big turning point here, it was a bit of casting. And in November 2019, Lady Gaga agreed to join the film. And this was a huge deal. She'd won an Oscar earlier that year for her work in A Star is Born, but also she'd broken through as a movie star as well as a singer in A Star is Born as well. It'd been a huge box office hit. It had earned her an Oscar nomination for her acting, won her an Oscar for her music, and whatever her next role was going to have profile instantly. So she was basically going to take on the role of Patrizia Reggiani in the movie that Angelina Jolie had been close to before. And the idea already at that point was to have the film ready for release at the end of 2021, assuming a studio would come in and pick the project up. Well, a studio did just that. In April 2020, just as coronavirus delays were starting to hit the film industry, in came MGM. Now, MGM, of course, was one of the first impacted by movie delays as a result of COVID lockdowns, in that it was backing No Time to Die, and I think we all by now know the story of No Time to Die and its many delays. But in April 2020, it inked a deal to back House of Gucci, with Ridley Scott directing, Lady Gaga starring, and finally, the film had the green light. The US rights, distribution rights, were being handled by United Artists Releasing, which is MGM's distribution arm. Elsewhere, Universal Pictures agreed to distribute the movie, and they were heading forward. Ridley Scott had the small matter of completing a film called The Last Duel that he was making at the time. That was a movie that had to shut down as a result of COVID lockdowns. It shut down mid-production, so he had to finish that film off first. But then the plan was, once he'd done with The Last Duel, whenever the world opened up again, he would go straight on to do House of Gucci. Again, Ridley Scott, not a man who tends to wait around or mess around. Casting wise then, alongside Lady Gaga, Adam Driver was very high on the list for the film, but there were concerns about his scheduling at this point. In fact, Chris Evans' name was mentioned as a possible replacement for him, and I would imagine it was delays caused to other productions by COVID that meant that Driver's schedule freed up to the point where he could squeeze in playing the role of Maurizio Gucci in the film. Now, those delays to the filming of Gucci were in part because as soon as lockdown finished, Ridley Scott then went and finished The Last Duel later than expected and got through the post-production of that as well. Meanwhile, casting was going on for the Gucci movie. That in August of 2020, in came Jared Leto, Al Pacino, Jack Houston was in, Reeve Carney was in. The last big name to join the film in December 2020 was Jeremy Irons. And finally, in March of 2021, filming could begin on the movie. It was going to be shot entirely in Italy. It was going to be shot under COVID conditions with all sorts of precautions in there. And Scott basically went from finishing The Last Duel, jumping straight on to making House of Gucci. Then once he'd made House of Gucci, he was going to have to edit that and also promote The Last Duel, and then get ready to release House of Gucci after that. It was going to be a very, very busy year for him. It helped, though, that it was a brisk, efficient shoot for the Gucci movie, that it began on 8th of March 2021. In fact, it's said to have begun the very end of February, but the official start of production was marked as early March. It was also wrapped up by early May. The publicity was building very early on, that an image was released the day after the official start of production with Lady Gaga and Adam Driver in some particularly fetching knitwear in that image as well. And interest was starting to build. Now, Scott told Vulture that Lady Gaga went very method for her role, and that Jared Leto did as well. Gaga was said to have had this character basically in her head for 12-18 months, and really threw herself into research and putting it across authentically. I think she's the standout performance in the movie. Scott went out of his way to praise Jared Leto in the role of Paolo Gucci for building a character where he had less real-life reference to work with than the others. Leto's commitment couldn't really be faulted in that he was spending 4 to 5 hours a day in makeup. He reportedly never broke character between takes, meaning that he talked in the same way as he played the role to everybody right throughout the filming of the movie. Just imagine that. Now, Scott had made the decision by this stage, of course, to have his cast talk in Italian accents rather than speaking English accents or Italian with subtitles. And he did admit, he said at first I was anxious, the fact that some smart aleck might say, well, it's Italians, why is it not in Italian? And he said, well, because, you idiot, you'd have to have subtitles and people don't tend to see expensive subtitle movies. That was his answer. And so he said of his actors at one point, I was distracted because of the Italian accent, but he said, but in this way they were so adept and it was just so tied into who they were. And he said, I mean, there's moments where Jared was positively comical. Fantastic, said Ridley Scott. That was all from the Vulture piece. And so filming wrapped up, and then Scott went on the press tour for The Last Duel. The Last Duel came out and didn't do very well at all. It lost an awful lot of money. Whatever you think of the movie, the box office realities of it were quite stinging and quite harsh. And the worry for Hollywood was that as we coming out of lockdown, people weren't looking to see, quote marks, grown-up films, adult dramas, not those kind. And films such as King Richard, for instance, that had struggled to break through. Respect, the Aretha Franklin biopic, had barely made a scratch at the box office. And like 3-4 years earlier, these were the kind of films that would have at least soaked up a bit of money. Now they were heading onto cinema screens and disappearing pretty much without trace. Hugh Jackman starred in a film called Reminiscence, which I think barely scraped a few $1 million at the box office. And so it was tricky. And there were worries about, well, will House of Gucci really fit in the midst of this? So the film was marked for its world premiere in London on November the 9th, 2021, and it did get to have an in-person premiere as well ahead of its broad release. And as he embarked on the press tour for House of Gucci, Scott infamously had lots of words to say about why Last Duel had failed. I believe his phrase was he pinned that one on millennials. I think that's his words. And he's pretty scathing about some elements of the modern cinema industry and what audiences were looking for. I have to say, it's one of the most hugely entertaining press tours that I can remember in recent times. And the fact that Scott had to do 2 press tours back to back meant he was in the headlines for several weeks, giving zero shits, in truth, about what he was saying, just speaking his mind through no filter whatsoever, and incredibly entertaining as a result of that. When House of Gucci made it in front of critics and made it to cinemas, well, the critical response was pretty divided on this one. In fact, it's still divided on this one. Some people really liked it an awful lot. Others found it quite comical and a bit odd. Just proving that, there's an opinion for everything, really. Whilst 1 or 2 people in particular called out Jared Leto's performance as, let's just say, very, very taxing. Mark Kermode did an already infamous famous review of the film where his thoughts on Leto, I think they're not a million miles away from mine, to be honest. I find Leto's performance in the film just one of the most baffling I've ever seen in a mainstream movie. Conversely, the other, he makes Al Pacino look quiet, doesn't he? But the other performances, well, they were coming in for some praise. And I noted while researching this that Leto's picked up some Best Supporting Actor acting nominations for his work in this movie. So, what do I know? It's working for some people. The film as a whole was received quite well, but to the glee of Hollywood, when it opened in cinemas, it became the first drama of its ilk for a very long time. I think really since Sam Mendes' 1917, which had been nearly 2 years before, to break through at the box office. It opened with, well, it's Thanksgiving 5-day weekend in the US was $22 million and opened in third place behind Disney's Encanto and Ghostbusters Afterlife on its second week. Marvel's Eternals was still hanging around. There was a new Resident Evil film, Welcome to Raccoon City, around there as well. And it was a moment. I mean, it shows to just where cinema had got to that we weren't expecting to see numbers of that size for films of this ilk again. Now, appreciating the Gucci name brings it with it some degree of profile, and it was all star laden. Nonetheless, I mean, King Richard was lingering down the bottom of the chart at the point that this movie came out, and it was a struggle to see films of this ilk breaking through, and House of Gucci did. Now, it hung around in the chart for a couple of weeks, and at the point this podcast is being recorded, it is still floating around in cinemas as well. It's up to 49 million in America, 77 million overseas, for a worldwide gross of 126 million. This is recorded before Oscar nominations for 2022 have been revealed. So who knows? It might be about to sweep the board. I don't think it will. I would say if Jared Leto gets a Best Supporting Actor Oscar nomination, I think I would just guffaw right the way through to the next podcast. That notwithstanding, this proved to be a hit, a far bigger hit than The Last Duel as well. However, it is also worth noting there has been some response to it. The Gucci family are not amongst its fans, to the point where it released a statement in late November 2021 arguing that the production of the film did not bother to consult the heirs before describing Aldo Gucci, who's played by Al Pacino in the film, the president of the company for 30 years, and the members of the Gucci family as thugs, ignorant and insensitive to the world around them. These are the words of the statement. The statement, first released to the Italian media, added that the film attributes a tone and an attitude to the protagonists of the well-known events that never belonged to them. It was a really strongly worded statement, but tellingly, there was no threat of legal action within it. I have to say again, I'm not sure Ridley Scott would be enormously bothered about that, because he gave an interview to Total Film where he said the people that were writing from the family to us at the onset were alarmingly insulted, saying that Al Pacino did not represent physically Aldo Gucci in any shape or form. Scott didn't have much shrift with this. He said, frankly, how could they be better represented than by Al Pacino? Excuse me, you probably have the best actors in the world. You should be so, what's that word? Clucking, I think it is. I think that's my handwriting. You should be so clucking lucky. He also leapt to the defence of Jared Leto, who was getting a bit of press at the time. He said, we found the pictures and Jared did what he did and dressed the way Paolo dressed. There's not a lot of Paolo on camera talking, and so that had to be, to a certain extent, imagined. And he said Paolo was a very colourful and flamboyant man. One person who wasn't keen as well was Tom Ford, fashion designer who worked with Gucci for a decade, and he gave an interview to Airmail magazine saying that he felt deeply sad for several days after watching the film, but also that he laughed out loud at it. And I think there's a general consensus that this isn't a definitive telling of a story, but it is an entertaining one. And I confess, I quite like this film. I think it goes on for well over 2.5 hours. Nonetheless, I think it's a pretty good piece of work, and for a film that sat around in development for 20 odd years before it got made, some achievement to get it over the line. But for Ridley Scott, of course, the work just goes on, because as soon as House of Gucci was out into the world, he'd cast his next film, Kitbag, which at the point this is being recorded, he's just about to start shooting. I tell you what, as well, I can't wait for the press tour for that one. Which brings me to the end of this latest episode of the Film Stories podcast. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you as always for listening. If I've not bored you completely, and I tried at half time, I've tried again now, you can find me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find the podcast and in fact the entire Film Stories project on Twitter at Film Stories Pod. That Patreon again is patreon.com/Simon Brew. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/Film Stories Online. We're on YouTube, youtube.com/Film Stories. And then there's the Film Stories website, which is filmstories.co.uk, updated every weekday with lots of movie news, reviews, features, bits and bobs there. Film Stories magazines, though, well, there's a couple of those that have come out since my last podcast. Issue 30 of Film Stories magazine has just arrived at the point I was pressing record on this. Kenneth Branagh, a huge interview with Kenneth Branagh leads that one. That's going to be shipping just in the next day or two at the point I'm recording. Film Stories Junior, meanwhile, is the only film magazine I know of its type for under 15s, for young film fans. It's primarily written by them as well. New issue of that, 52 pages filled with film mayhem there. That is also shipping. Now, you can find both of those at store.filmstories.co.uk, and I thank you so much for supporting independent publishing and all the people who have done to date. Most important, though, particularly in these times, is that you all stay safe and well and you all look after yourselves. It's really good to be back, and I thank you for coming back and listening to this podcast, or welcome to you if it's the first time. I'll be back soon with another bunch of film stories. Until then, you all take care. Bye-bye.
Chaps, hang on to your knickers.